Hello to everybody. I want to welcome you all here. We're so excited to celebrate yet again another Siyum. It's very exciting these months. We get to see each other every once a month and get together and finish the Masechet together. So it's great having you all here. The more of you who want to open your video screens, it would be great to see everybody. So thank you all for coming. Today's Siyum is sponsored by Valerie Adler in honor of her niece, Dr. Ayelet Lipson, who will be sharing with us an introduction to Masechet Ta'anit tonight, who we all admire, and Rabbanit Michelle for the inspiring Dapim so far. Mazal Tov to all. And thank you, Valerie, for sponsoring the Siyum. Okay, tonight we're going to first learn the end of the last daf. As usual, we'll do the Siyum. We will hear from Dr. Alana Stein-Hain about the shofar. Then we will hear from Dr. Ayelet Lipson about the introduction to Ta'anit. And then we will get to hear from Meira Shapiro, who is one of our learners. Okay, we're going to get started learning the daf. So our daf today is daf lamed hey, and it's a very interesting way to end the Masechet. So we're going to start a little bit further back just to review. We had an interesting end to the Masechet, where the Masechet and the Mishnah, the very end of the Mishnah, kind of switched off. It was a little bit strange. It kind of went from talking about the shofar blows to this interesting machloka between Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis about davening, it seems like, okay? I want to first state that there's three different ways to understand what the Mishnah was referring to. So the Mishnah reads like this. We start with Rabban Gamliel, the rabbis say, Kashem shliach tzibor chayav, kach kol yachid v'yachid chayav. Just like the Hazan, person in charge of davening on behalf of everybody, is obligated, so is everybody else. Everyone has to daven on their own, which is what you would have expected. And in fact, we saw that you can't daven for somebody else. We talked about that before. You know, no one can daven for you in the morning. You have to do your own davening. So it obviously makes sense. But Rabban Gamliel has this approach. It's very interesting. And he says that shliach tzibor motzi et harabim yidei chovato. And people have a lot of issues trying to understand. Is he referring to davening every day? Is he referring to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur specifically? Is this Mishnah, this machloket, referring to Tkiyat Shofar even? Some people think that it's a reference to Tkiyat Shofar. This is in Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which recently went up on Sefaria. So if your Hebrew is good, it's not yet translated, unfortunately, but you can now find it on Sefaria easily. And he suggests it's actually talking about the shofar blast, which makes a lot more sense in the context of the Mishnah. Of course, doesn't make so much sense because there was a thought that everybody had to blow the shofar on their own. And he claims that, in fact, there really was. And if you remember, we learned earlier that in Yavne, everyone would take out their shofar and start blowing after. Remember when the Hazan finished, everyone would take out their own shofar. And he claims that we're just so biased, and the Rishonim were biased by what they saw happening, that nobody was blowing shofar on their own, that they couldn't possibly think that the Mishnah was referring to that. So I'm throwing out there that there's a bunch of different possible suggestions. Then we ended yesterday's daf or 2 days ago. I hope I'm not confusing people. By the way, if you're listening to this on podcast, you might get a little confused, especially if you're new and you just started learning Masechet Ta'anit today, which Baruch Hashem, many, many people started learning Masechet Ta'anit. So thank you for all those who helped with our campaign to get more people learning. It worked. And if you're learning Ta'anit and all of a sudden on the podcast, you're going to see Masechet Rosh Hashanah come up, you can listen, but don't get too confused. There was no way to organize it any better since Ta'anit started today and our Siyum was only now. Okay, so now we had Rabbi Yochanan quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the rabbis ended up agreeing with Rabban Gamliel, which is fascinating because you would think that we kind of were all of the opinion that everybody has to daven on their own, but in fact, they agree with Rabban Gamliel. And then we said that really Rav said no, they still disagree. And then we said even Rish Lakish, when he heard Rabbi Yochanan say it, he said no, they still disagree. And now we ended with this question. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chana from Tzipori, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabban Gamliel. We hold like Rabban Gamliel. Now, when we say, again, this is all what we do in the Gemara, we infer from statements that are made. Somebody said, we hold like Rabban Gamliel. That means that they mean that there's a machloket. Otherwise, you don't have to say we hold like someone if everyone agrees. So it must be that the rabbis disagree. Otherwise, and according to Rabbi Yochanan himself says this. So we're a little bit confused. On one hand, Rabbi Yochanan seems to say they all agree. The rabbis agree with Rabban Gamliel. On the other hand, he seems to say, no, we hold like Rabban Gamliel, but the rabbis disagree. So we're just trying to figure that out. So starting now with Lamed Hey. Kislik Rabbi Abba miyame pirsha. When he came from the sea, Rabbi Abba. Remember, we learned about the people would go to the sea, and that's where they would learn all sorts of things because it was the port. And in a port city, you hear lots of different things. You meet people from different places. So when he came back from there, he explained, Pirsha. Modim chachamim el Rabban Gamliel bebarachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim. When the rabbis agreed, it was only regarding Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, meaning Yom Kippur of the Yovel year. Okay, it was only regarding those tefillot. He makes a very easy distinction. He says we're going to distinguish between the regular days of the year and the days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then we can say, Shliach Tzibor is motzi. He can basically cover your tefillot. You don't actually have to daven on Rosh Hashanah, that long davening. Okay, I said last night at the Siyum and Ranan, whenever we got to shul on Musaf Rosh Hashanah, when it got up to shul, my father would make a joke when I was little and say, "I'll pick you up, tonight," because it took me a long time to get through all those words when I was younger. So he used to make a joke that it's the longest davening there is. So it makes sense. And a davening like that, we can have somebody fulfill our obligation. But the rabbis still disagree with Rabban Gamliel when it came to everyday prayers. So now the Gemara, it sounds like a good answer. However, what happened now? Wait. And this is classic in the Gemara. It's a very nice suggestion, but it doesn't work because Rabbi Yochanan and we have another statement that Rabbi Yochanan Tzipora said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Here you have it. You can't say that because he specifically said in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we hold like the rabbis. So we hold like Rabban Gamliel, which means the rabbis obviously disagree with him on that. So it was a very nice theory, but it doesn't work. So Ella Amarav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, a creative answer. Man Modim, who's the one who agrees? When he said the rabbis in the earlier statement of Rabbi Yochanan, when we said Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the rabbis agreed, he wasn't talking about all the rabbis. He was talking about someone in particular. Who in particular? Rabbi Meir. We now have almost three categories. There's Rabbi Gamliel. He disagrees with the rabbis. The rabbis don't agree with him. They end up disagreeing forever. And Rabbi Meir comes in and he says, I agree with Rabbi Gamliel. How do we know this? It's not just coming out of the blue, but we have a source like everything else today, right? We pull out sources to knock out answers. Here, we're going to pull out a source to prove our answer. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Brachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim, Shliach Tzibur Motzi Rabim Yedei Chavatan Divrei Rabbi Meir. Here you have Rabbi Meir says exactly what Rabban Gamliel said. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and then it's specifically Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he agrees, not all prayers. The Shliach Tzibur is Motzi the Rabim Yedei Chovatan. Okay, he helps those all fulfill their obligation, and individuals don't actually need to pray. The Chachamim Obrim and the rabbis obviously disagree. So now comes the big question. Ma'ishna, what's the difference? Hane. If it's because there's so many verses, remember we learned 10 verses or 7 verses or 3 verses, and not everybody knows. Remember, in the days where there were no Sidurim, it was very complicated. You had to get up to daven and you had to know 10 verses of Malchio, 10 verses of Shofar, right? I'll test you all. Do you know 10 verses of Malchio? Could you give me 10 verses of Shofar, right? Not so simple. So, right, especially without a computer in front of you to kind of Google it. Now, it might be a lot easier to do this with Safari or some other kind of search engine, which obviously you can't use on Rosh Hashanah when you're in shul trying to figure this out. So, in any case, we're going to say maybe because of that. But something very surprising, especially in light of things that we learned, okay, we pass this down in the name of Rav, that what? As long as you say, if you don't know psukim, it's okay. You don't actually need 10 verses. You don't need 7 verses. You don't even need 3 verses. You can just say in the Torah, it says. And some people claim not just in the Torah, you'd have to say in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, and in the Ketuvim, because remember, you need from each section. Whether you say that or that, but the point is, all you need to say are those 3 words, you don't need to say any more. You don't need all the verses. Now, this seems very strange. Remember, we said you can't do any less than 10 or 7 or 3. So how all of a sudden do we not need any verses? So first of all, many people think that this was actually said originally for Musaf in general. Musaf is a prayer where we list all the sacrifices done that day. And in fact, in certain Sephardi communities, they actually don't say all we say in Ashkenazi communities, and in some Sephardi communities, we say in the Musaf, we list all the sacrifices that we bring. In some communities, they only say Ubitarat Chakachuv Lemor, and they don't actually say it. And part of the reason is there's a concern that you're actually going to say the wrong thing. And since our prayers are in place of sacrifices, we don't want you to mess up and say the wrong thing. So as a result, they just say it very simply, and it says so in the Torah, and kind of like look there, and you'll find all the details there. And they don't actually say it in the Daven. So that's what he says here. The same thing would apply for Rosh Hashanah. Now, how could it apply for Machliot Zichronot and Shaparot? So some people claim, again, it's a little bit, it's difficult in light of what we saw before. Some people claim that only if you start saying verses, do you have to then do the minimum number. But if you actually don't start, you can suffice with just this statement. It's very interesting. So in any case, it seems like that's not the biggest deal, because you can really get away with saying just, and in the Torah it says. By the way, you could maybe distinguish Hazan versus individual. Maybe the Hazan has to do all the psukim, but if you're an individual, maybe they give you a break because they know it's not so easy. So in the end, they say, Afshay brachot. It's because there's a lot of brachot. Okay, Afshay can be interpreted in two ways. One is a lot of brachot. One is it's very loud from all the brachot and all the people praying, and it's hard to focus. And you won't be able to focus properly. It's a little bit strange to say that. Didn't they daven Shmon Esrei silently? But maybe this is a source that maybe they did it out loud. And also there was shofar going in the middle of davening. It was distracting. And maybe because of that. So either which way, there's something different about this. Either it has a lot of blessings, even if you don't have to say all of the verses, you still have a lot of blessings. So Malchiyot, you have Zichronot, you have shofar. It's atypical. And because of that, Rabbi Meir ends up agreeing with Rabban Gamliel that you don't need to. And he distinguishes between a regular davening and Rosh Hashanah davening. Gufa. Now the Gemara wants to go a little bit more in depth into the statement that Rav Hananel said. Amar Rav Hananel amar Rav, kevan she'amar b'toratcha kachuv lemor, shuv eino tzarich. You don't need to say any more than that. Savur mina, they thought, and this is what I suggested before, maybe this is only for an individual and not the community. Of course, the rabbi, the Hazan, the cantor has to say everything. But in fact, that's not true. Whenever we see several mineh, right? These are keywords that you're going to start to get used to. Several mineh always means they thought, and eventually they're going to be proven wrong. And in fact, they're proven wrong here. Itmar, it was said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi, Echad Yachid, Echad Zibur, Kevan she'amar b'toratcha katuv lemor, shuv eino tzarich. Even in the community setting, the Chazan can get up and say, Toratcha katuv lemor, and done, right? That would make our davening much, much shorter on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Although it's not the only long part of our davening, right? We've added many additional piyutim, right? All these songs that we add. So it's not actually the longest part of davening, but it would make it a little bit shorter. Now we get to another section. Now what we talked before about, there was a debate between Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis about this shliach tzibur. And then they said, right, about the individuals. And then they said, well, according to you, Rabban Gamliel, why do individuals pray if they don't really need to? And he said, it's so that the Hazan can put together his prayers in his head. It's to buy him time, basically, so that he can go over his prayer. So now on that topic, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Olam yastir adam tfilato v'achar kach yitpalel. Any person who gets up to daven, again, this is in times without a sitter, should put together your thoughts. I mean, it's not even a bad idea if you have a sitter, but to put together your thoughts before you pray, collect your thoughts, know what you're going to say, go over the words, and only after that should you pray. Amar Rabbi Abba, but Rabbi Abba said, "Misaber milta de Rabbi Elazar b'brachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim v'shel prakim, aval dekol Hashanah lo." He says, I think he's really only referring to special days, but the everyday prayers, everybody knows them, and you don't need every day to go through your prayers and check. These are things that we already know. We know them by heart. It's not an issue. It's only on things that happen once a month, once every few months, once a year, etc. So now the Gemara questions that, Ini, and they question it from a rabbi. And what he did, V'harav Yehuda, mitzader slote umatzle, he would organize his prayers every time before he davened. So you would think maybe he's going beyond the letter of the law, right? That would be the easiest explanation. But instead of saying that, the Gemara gives a very shocking explanation, although those who learn Masechet Brachot might remember this. Shane Rav Yehuda, kevan demitaltin yom and litaltin yom and havamatzle, kiprakim dame. Since he would daven only once every 30 days, his daily prayer was like something that only happens once in a while. And he had to do that because he only prayed once every 30 days. What do you mean? He didn't pray every day, 3 times a day, right? What kind of rabbi doesn't pray 3 times a day? So in fact, there's a halacha that if your Torah is your job and that's all you do, you're actually exempt from praying. And he actually, according to the Gemara here, he actually didn't pray. He only prayed once every 30 days. Why once every 30 days? Not sure, although it's very nice that our Masechet is ending with things that happen once every 30 days. That's how we started with the cycle of the moon. And, maybe he davened Rosh Chodesh, who knows, right? Maybe that was the once a month that he would daven, right? So hard to imagine Rav Yehuda, who is second generation Amoraim. He's always quoting from Rav and Shmuel. He was Talmid of both of the great rabbis. And yet he was such a strong student that he actually didn't daven. So for him, he had to organize his prayers because it didn't come so easily to him. Okay, last section of today's daf, a very interesting way to end our Masechet. Amar Rav Acha bar Ravira, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Poter haya Rabban Gamliel afilu am shebesadot. Now, there's a lot, I'm not going to get into all the details here, but there's a lot of confusion a little bit about when Rabban Gamliel said that the Shliach Tzibor fulfills the obligation for everyone, who exactly is he referring to? And here we have Rabbi Shimon Chasida saying that he didn't only mean, you might have thought he meant everyone in the building, right? Whoever's there, they don't really need to daven. The Shliach Tzibor is covering their prayer for them. And in fact, those who say, because we paskin like Rabban Gamliel, is that only works, by the way, if you're listening and you have to hear every word. But comes Rabbi Shimon Chasida and he says, and in fact, many poskim say, this is why we don't hold like this anymore, because nobody could possibly concentrate on listening to every single word. And all the more so, because in our repetition of Shemona Esrei on Rosh Hashanah now, we've added so many extra things, right? That it's true, right? It's impossible to concentrate on every single thing the Hazan is saying. So therefore, you can no longer count on relying on Rabban Gamliel nowadays, because we wouldn't be able to really listen to every word. You'd have to listen to every word. But Rabbi Shimon Chasida obviously had a bit of a different idea. And he says, Poteria Rabban Gamliel, afilu am shebesadot. Now, what he seems to be saying is not only the people in shul, not only the people in the city, but even people who maybe could hear or at least are close by, but even people that are out in the fields. Some people say, what are they doing out in the fields on Rosh Hashanah? Well, first of all, people did guard fruits on Rosh Hashanah. So it could be that they were out in the fields on Rosh Hashanah guarding the fruits. Some people say that maybe he was talking about a weekday, but it doesn't really seem that way. But he claims that the people out in the fields, even they're included in the prayers of the Hazan. To which the Gemara says, 1 minute, right? And that doesn't include, obviously he means afilu. The words, again, we're going to be very careful about the wording. Even, which means even obviously the people in the city and even the people in the fields. But then the Gemara says, adrabah, it should be the exact opposite. Those people out in the fields are stuck. They have no choice. But the people in the city who don't think it's important enough to go to shul, so right, they could get there, they just don't. They're going to be exempt from the Hazan's tefillah by sitting in their house. That seems absurd. Rabbi Abba says, just like he says, if you're in shul when they're doing Birkat Kohanim, they're duchening the Kohanim, and you're in the hallway, or you're behind the Kohanim, you don't get the bracha. You have to be in front of them. If you're not bothering to go into the room where they're giving the bracha, you don't get a bracha. And likewise here, if you're going to be in your house in the city where there's a shul and you don't go to shul, of course you're not going to be covered. So they basically say, Ela ki'ata Ravin, when Ravin came from Israel and passed on what had been said, Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, he said the name of Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, instead of Rav Acha bar Avira, who said the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida, someone else passed down the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Lo patar Rabban Gamliel, Ela am shebesadot, not afilu, Ela. They're the ones who Rabban Gamliel said. Rabban Gamliel said, the Shliach Tzibor's prayer can now, right, forget about the fact that we discussed the other day, right? How could you possibly wake up in the morning and say to my friend, can you pray for me? So according to Rabban Gamliel, you can't have your friend pray for you, but you can have the Shliach Tzibor pray for you. Only though if you're in shul and listening, it seems like, again, there's different ways to understand it. So I'll kind of say a way of looking at it, but it is open to interpretation. Or if you're not in shul, but you couldn't get there because you had some issue, right? You broke your leg and you can't make it to shul, or you were out in the fields, whatever it is. In the fields is just an example. Then it will cover you. My time, mishum ta'anise b'melacha, aval be'ir. But if you have no excuse, you can't have your prayers covered. And this is the way the Masechet ends. A really, really interesting way to end the Masechet. I'll say the words Hadron alach Yom Tov, Uslika al Masechet Rosh Hashanah. We finish the parak of Yom Tov and we finish with that Rosh Hashanah. But I want to add here a little bit. I want to talk about what this is, what's going on here. And I want to do a little bit of a summary of our whole Masechet, a bit of a perspective, and a lead into Masechet Ta'anit. So if you look at the similarities between Rosh Hashanah and Ta'anit, there's something interesting about the juxtaposition, right? We would have expected Rosh Hashanah, Yoma, right? Yom Kippur should have come, then Sukkah, then maybe Beitzah, Yom Tov in general, and then Ta'aniyot. What are Ta'aniyot? They're fast days. We're going to hear more from Ayala today, but they're fast days that are instituted for the public when there's a public issue, right? There's no rain, there's some other issue, and they're public fast days. So what's the similarity between both of them? Both Rosh Hashanah talks about the new moon. It's a natural phenomenon. And the fast days talk about rain, which is a natural phenomenon. But both of them need human intervention, right? We need to pray for rain. That's going to be the theme of Masechet Ta'anit. We need to we need to declare the new moon. That's up to us, right? The world was created on Rosh Hashanah, but it's up to us to do tshuva every year, right? Both the theme of tshuva, of tefillah, tzedakah, all those, that's a big theme, both in Rosh Hashanah and in Ta'aniyot. So they're very, very similar, more similar than you would have thought at first glance. However, there's a very big difference. And I already said that they're called Ta'aniyot Tzibor, which is communal fasts. And we've talked about this throughout the Masechet. There's a certain role that the individual is playing here. There's a lot of interplay, both in this Masechet and the next one, about Yachid and Tzibor, and when things apply to an individual and when they apply to a community. And what I want to show you is that in Ta'aniyot, it's going to be more of a focus on the community. And in Rosh Hashanah, it's more of a focus on the individual. And I'll give you a few examples. We saw that the first main example is everybody passes before God, kivnei marom, right? Like sheep, or there were different explanations of it, but we all get judged individually on Rosh Hashanah. We had the Re'iyah and the Shmi'ah. We talked about the seeing the new moon and the hearing the new moon. Even though the court declares the new moon, it's really only if witnesses come forward. And we talked about the whole importance of every individual witness coming and not deterring them from coming. We talked about the Yedei Moshe, that he had to hold his hands up. And we talked there about how it was all about it wasn't like the version in the Mechilta that was all miraculous. It was, no, if people looked up and they were focused and they were concentrating on God, that's what brought it about. And the Masechet keeps focusing on the individual's role. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that it ends with the importance of the individual. Every individual, unless you're, anus and you can't help it. But if you can, you have to pray, right? You can't rely on someone else taking care of it for you. And then there was this issue, and the fast days, we talked about how it's a Pinuphia, it's a gathering of people. The whole idea, they go out into the middle of the city and they're going to pray there. And it's very much about the tzibur, the community. And if you remember, we already saw a whole bunch of comparisons. One, for example, was I believe it was in the daf just before, which was about, are the brachot ma'agvot, right, on Lamed Daled, and the tefillot, right, the tzkiot, how they don't, right, on Rosh Hashanah, you have to do it exactly so. On Ta'aniyot, it's okay. If you skipped a bracha, you skipped a shofar blast, it's not so important. So what's this comparison? I think that there's the idea, and I think it's apropos that Rosh Hashanah leads into Ta'aniyot, because in order to work as a community together, we all first need to work on ourselves. And when we work on ourselves, we have to be very exacting. We have to do it just so and do it just right and have our own way of doing it. When we're a community, right, we saw that you don't have to have as much kavanah and davening if you're in the community. You can get away with things because we have the strength of community. But as an individual, you can't rely on that. And I think that there's an idea here that first you need to work on yourself as an individual. And after that, you can then give to the community. And that's why first we have Rosh Hashanah, which is almost, right, as much as we think of Rosh Hashanah, this is an amazing day and very important, but it's almost like it's preparing you for life. It's this one unique day a year that really prepares you for the rest of the year and gives you the tools that you're going to need to be part of a community and be with them. I want to quote you a quote from Natan Sharansky's book, Fear No Evil. And in the end of his preface, he says the following, and it's exactly this idea. So I'm going to read to you now. He talked about how he grew up in a generation where his parents basically assimilated. That was their idea, to try to blend in and leave their Jewish roots behind. And he talks about the difference between their generation and what he learned. And he said, for the activist Jews of my generation, our movement represented the exact opposite of what our parents had gone through when they were young. But we saw what had happened to their dreams, and we understood that the path to liberation could not be found in denying our own roots while pursuing universal goals, right? He's talking about this idea of the individual versus the universal. On the contrary, we had to deepen our commitment, because only he who understands his own identity and has already become a free person can work effectively for the human rights of others. It's exactly that concept. And the next line, you'll be amazed, he says, in Israel, when I was writing this book, I came upon an image by the American writer Cynthia Ozick that captures this idea perfectly. You ready? The shofar, the ram's horn, that is sounded in the synagogue on the high holidays is narrow at one end and wide at the other. Remember, we had the whole sugya, you can't change it and flip it. Nothing happens if you blow into the wide end. But if you blow into the narrow end, the call of the shofar rings loud and true. And there's this beautiful idea about going through the narrow end, through the individual, and that's what makes the shofar blast wider at the end and to be able to capture everyone. And I thought I could think of no more beautiful image for what I see in front of me today with all of your beautiful faces and all of the learning that's surrounding us. And the idea about how each of us in our learning is deepening our individual commitment to Judaism, to our traditions, to learning, to understanding. But you can't, the community that we've created and that we all feel such a strong part of is, our individual, the fact that we've worked on ourselves as individuals allows us to be part of this beautiful community. So thank you for being part of it. And with that, we will now say the Hadrons together. I'll share my screen. Okay, everybody ready? Here goes. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon mefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu shetehei toratcha umanutenu ba'olam hazeh utehei imanu la'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Adar bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befinu ufipiot amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu kulanu tze'etze'enu v'tze'etze'e amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yod'ei shemecha v'lomdei toratcha lishma. Me'ovai tichachmeni mitzvotecha ki la'olam hi li. Yehi libi tamim b'chukecha leman lo evosh. La'olam lo eshkach pikudecha ki bam chiyitani. Baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Amen, 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 Sela va'ed. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Elohai kashem she'azartani l'sayem Masechet Rosh Hashanah ken ta'azreni lahatchil Masechtot u'sfarim acherim u'lesaymam lilmod u'lelamed l'shmor v'la'asot u'lekayem et kol divrei Talmud Toratcha bi'ava u'zchut kol atanaim ve'amoraim v'talmidei chachamim yamod lanu u'lezarenu shelo tamush haTorah mipinu u'mipi zarenu ad olam. V'yitkayem banu b'hitalachacha tanche otcha b'shokbecha tishmor alecha v'hakitzota hi tisichecha. Ki vi yirbu yamecha v'yosifu lecha shnot chayim orech yamim b'yamina b'smola osher v'kavod Adonai oz la'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Asher koach mazal tov lekulam shemesaymot. Thank you to all excited that we're finishing together. Mazal tov to everybody who finished.